Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. Some endings aren't loud. There's no clear goodbye, no door slamming shut. Just an ordinary evening when you suddenly realize you've been standing in a doorway for too long, and behind you, a door has already closed quietly. Ben sat alone in the office. Most of the overhead lights were off now, leaving only the dim glow of his laptop screen and a small desk lamp tucked into the corner. Outside the glass wall, the city still held a few scattered lights, but they were thinning. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a background rhythm, trying to keep the space from falling into complete silence. Ben was 31, working in a startup used to things being not finished. At home or at the office, his mind always carried a list: what still needed fixing, optimizing, catching up. For him, endings were usually just pauses before picking things back up. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the sense of "I'll restart this" didn't feel as certain. On the screen was a short email. Not many words. Not rude. Not dramatic. Just a polite notice that the partner was pulling out. A project he'd prepared for over months, calls, plans, pitch decks revised late into the night. And in the end, the result fit neatly into a few courteous lines. Ben had read the email many times. Each time his brain automatically searched for a crack. Maybe they'd change their mind. Maybe he could persuade them. Maybe he could revise the proposal. He was used to reopening doors that seemed closed. In the past, sometimes it worked. But some doors don't close because of a lack of effort. They close because the timing has shifted. He placed both hands on the keyboard as if typing a few lines could reverse everything. His fingers hovered, then stopped. He noticed the tension in his wrists, in his jaw too. A familiar bracing, like preparing for an argument or a final sprint. He let out a breath slower than usual, not because he was trying to calm down, just because his body was tired of staying ready to fight. Ben looked around the office. On the wall, a whiteboard filled with arrows, boxes, and half-erased notes. On the corner of the desk, an old coffee cup, the ice long melted. Everything looked like a place still in motion, even though the only person left was sitting still. He thought about the idea of a closed door. It sounded like a comforting phrase people used to soften disappointment. But tonight, it wasn't a phrase. It was physical. Like placing your hand on a doorknob, trying to turn it and realizing the lock is set. You can turn it again. You can knock. But the other side stays silent. What exhausted Ben wasn't losing the opportunity itself. It was the fact that his mind kept running, as if the opportunity were still in his hands. With each loop of thought, another version appeared. If only I'd sent the email earlier. If only I'd chosen different words. If only I hadn't missed that call. Those if onlys felt like standing in front of a closed door, blaming yourself for not stepping through in time. Ben rested a hand on the laptop lid. It was slightly warm. He didn't close it right away. He just kept his hand there, noticing a simple truth tonight. There might be nothing left to fix immediately, not because he had failed, but because the situation had changed shape. He stood and walked toward the glass wall. The city outside looked blurrier now. Distant lights made everything feel like it was drifting. Ben rested his forehead lightly against the cold glass, then stepped back. The chill pulled him into the present like a quiet reminder. I'm here, right now, in a silent room. He returned to the desk and sat down. This time he didn't open another tab. He didn't search for more data. He read the email once more, then let the cursor sit still. His hand rested on the trackpad, but didn't move. There was a very small moment, almost invisible from the outside, when Ben allowed himself not to know the next step. Not knowing didn't mean giving up. It meant that for the first time in months, he didn't have to force the future to be clear in the middle of the night. He closed the laptop. The soft click echoed quietly through the office. Not a slam, just the sound of something being set down. Ben stayed seated after that sound, feeling the silence flow into the space it created. A door had closed. But the most exhausting part wasn't the door itself. It was the habit of standing there, staring at it, and blaming yourself. And in this moment, Ben wasn't doing that anymore. He just sat, listened to the hum of the air conditioner, and let the night hold the rest for him. After closing the laptop, Ben didn't stand up right away. He stayed seated in the dimmer room, as if his body needed a buffer between running and stopped. The air conditioner kept humming unchanged, a steady background rhythm that kept the space from feeling too empty. He placed both hands on his thighs, not clenched, not tense, just resting there. It felt strange having hands that didn't need to be ready for the next task, but it also felt light, like setting down something he'd been carrying for too long. Ben stood up and turned off the desk lamp. The office sank into softer light enough to move around without seeing every detail clearly. The writing on the whiteboard faded into pale shapes. He didn't erase anything. There was no need. Those ideas had already done their work in that phase. He put on his jacket and stepped into the hallway. The office door closed behind him without a loud sound. Just the ordinary noise of a door being shut at the right time. Ben paused for a second, rested his hand on the handle, then walked away. He didn't look back. The hallway was quiet. Motion sensor lights turned on as he passed, then dimmed again behind him. Each section lit up, then faded, as if the building itself were guiding him into a different part of itself. Not fast, not slow. Outside, the night air was cool. Ben breathed in, then out. This breath wasn't cut short. No thoughts interrupted it. Just the breath of someone who had just stepped out of a closed room. He walked to the parking lot. The pavement reflected the lights in soft patches. Few cars, little noise. Ben opened his car door and sat down, but didn't start the engine yet. His hand rested on the steering wheel, feeling its familiar surface. A thought passed through him. If I don't keep going down the old path, where do I go next? But the question didn't tighten his chest like before. It was there, light, not demanding an answer right away. Like another room waiting, one that didn't need to be opened tonight. Ben started the car. The engine vibrated briefly, then settled. He drove out of the lot more slowly than usual. Not because he was tired, but because there was nothing he needed to chase right now. Traffic lights changed. The city at night unfolded in small sections. Ben didn't think about strategy, didn't think about emails, didn't think about proving anything. He let the road reveal itself piece by piece, just enough to drive. Some doors, when they close, don't immediately reveal another door in front of you. They create an empty space instead. And that space isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's the room you need to realize how cramped you've been standing for a long time. The car turned onto a familiar street. Porch lights glowed at a few houses. Ben slowed down and parked in front of his place. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment longer. Not out of regret, just because his body liked this slower rhythm. He went inside and turned on a small light. The space was quiet. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing was waiting to be finished. Ben set his keys on the table and hung his jacket on the hook. Small, ordinary movements, but they carried the feeling of coming home. He stood in the living room for a bit. Didn't turn on the TV. Didn't check his phone. Just stood there, letting the silence spread. Maybe tomorrow he'd think about a different direction. Maybe another door would appear. Or maybe not yet. But tonight he didn't need to open any new doors. One had already closed, and he had stepped away from its threshold. Ben turned off the lights and walked toward the bedroom. The night didn't ask him to know where he was going next. It only asked him to rest inside the new space that had quietly opened the space of not having to push anymore. Some words, when left unsaid, begin to speak inside us again and again. Not to be heard, but to be carried. And sometimes what exhausts us isn't that the other person doesn't understand, but that we've been carrying those unspoken words for far too long. Lila was 55, a volunteer at an end-of-life care center. Her work required quiet presence, listening more than advising. She was used to unfinished sentences, to things left unsaid before time closed in. Maybe that was why that evening when she got home, she felt a familiar pull to write. She turned on the small desk lamp in her study. The soft yellow light fell onto a wooden desk worn smooth at one corner. Lila pulled out the chair, sat down, opened a drawer, and took out a blank sheet of paper. No title, no "Dear Someone," just a wide open space. She held the pen and paused for a few seconds. Her hand didn't shake. She just didn't touch the paper yet. Some things, even when they've been ready inside us for a long time, still need a moment of permission to come out. Then she began to write. Not in order, not carefully polished. Some sentences were short, others long. Some words pressed darker into the page, others faded. Lila wrote about times she'd been misunderstood, moments she'd been overlooked, things she'd swallowed because she believed saying them wouldn't change anything. She wrote about anger that arrived late and quietly, but stayed for a long time. There were no sharp accusations, just truth placed on the page as honestly as she could manage right now. As she wrote, she didn't imagine the other person reading it. That wasn't necessary. This letter was never meant to be sent. With each line, a piece of weight moved out of her chest. It didn't disappear. It shifted. From inside her body onto the paper. And that movement alone made her breathing feel a little easier. She stopped when her hand grew tired, set the pen down, looked at the page filled with words. She didn't reread it from top to bottom. She didn't need to. She had already been inside every sentence while writing it. Reading it again wouldn't add anything. She folded the paper in half, then into quarters. Slow, careful movements. Not because she was afraid of tearing it, but because she was closing a flow. When she set the letter aside, she noticed her hand felt lighter, like she'd just put down something she'd been holding all day. Lila stood and went into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water. Cool, clear. She drank in small sips. Some evenings, the body needs very simple things to remember, that everything is safe. Back in the study, she looked at the letter again. It lay there quietly, not demanding, not urging, not needing a reply. And in that moment, Lila realized something gentle and true. Not every word needs a recipient to have meaning. Some words only need to be spoken so the speaker can finally rest. She picked up the letter and stood in front of the small trash bin beside the desk. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply stood there a little longer, making sure she didn't need to hold on to it anymore. The desk lamp lit the neatly folded paper. Outside, the night was still. Nothing pressed her. No deadline waited. The letter had done its work. Lila didn't burn the letter right away. She placed it back on the desk, turned off the light in her study, and walked slowly into the kitchen. Not because she was hesitating, but because her body needed a few more minutes to catch up with what had just happened. Some forms of letting go happen quickly in the mind, but take a little longer to sink into the body. In the kitchen, she turned on the small gas burner and set an old metal bowl on top. She didn't use a strong flame, just enough heat to warm. The pale blue flame stayed steady, no flaring, no rush. Lila watched it for a moment, as if matching her pace to its rhythm. She went back to the study and picked up the letter again. The paper felt softer now from being folded so many times. There was no sense of regret, only a clear stillness, like when a conversation has reached the point where nothing more needs to be said. Lila tore the letter in half, then into 4 pieces, then 8. Each tear made a very small sound, almost blending into the quiet hiss of the burner. She didn't reread a single word. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Now, it didn't need to keep its shape. She carried the pieces into the kitchen and dropped them one by one into the metal bowl. The paper touched the flame, curled inward, then darkened. There was no large fire, just a soft orange glow spreading slowly enough to change the paper. Lila stood there without interfering. No stirring, no rushing. When the last piece turned to ash, she turned off the stove. The kitchen returned to silence. Inside the bowl was a thin layer of pale gray ash. Words, no sentences, no voice left. Just the trace of something that had finished being said. She let the bowl cool, then carried it outside and poured the ash into a small planter on the balcony. The ash fell into the soil and blended in quickly, leaving no distinct form behind. She didn't think about symbolism. It simply felt right. What had once been heavy could now become something that fed something else. Back inside, Lila turned off all the lights, leaving only a dim glow in the hallway. The familiar space held her gently. She went into the bedroom, changed, and lay down. There was no feeling of mission accomplished, no sense of victory. Just the feeling of not having to carry anything anymore. Her breathing slowed and evened out. Her chest no longer felt tight like it had earlier in the evening. There were no sentences in her mind waiting to be written. No responses being prepared. A kind of emptiness appeared, but it wasn't cold. It felt like a room that had just been cleaned, carrying the faintest trace of freshness. Lila thought of the people she met through her work. People who had carried so many unsaid words until there was no longer time to speak them. And she realized that tonight she had given herself a very quiet gift, saying what could be said while there was still time so she wouldn't have to carry it any further. If old memories return tomorrow, that's okay. They can knock. But the door is no longer locked from the inside. Not because everything has been fully forgiven, but because she's no longer keeping herself trapped in the same room with them. Lila turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. The room was just dark enough. No sudden sounds, no thoughts needing attention. What remained was only the lightest sensation of a body that had finally set down an invisible weight. The unsent letter had completed its purpose. It didn't need a recipient. It didn't need a reply. It only needed to be written, and then allowed to dissolve. And in that dissolving, the night opened wide. Sleep arrived not as an ending, but as a deep pause when there were no more words left to hold. Henry paused on the porch before sitting down, as if checking whether the night was settled enough to hold him. The wooden boards were cool beneath his bare feet. A porch swing hung slightly off-center, moving just a little in the breeze, its chain making a soft, familiar creak. Somewhere beyond the yard, crickets kept time without hurry. He lowered himself onto the swing and let it take his weight. The motion was gentle, almost accidental. Back and forth, back and forth. Not enough to call it rocking, just enough to feel carried. Henry was 58 and recently retired from the military. For most of his adult life, his days had been planned down to the minute. Wake times, briefings, objectives, even rest had been scheduled. Now, for the first time in decades, there was space. Long unmarked stretches of it. People had congratulated him, told him he'd earned this, asked what he was going to do next. Henry never quite knew how to answer. He had expected retirement to feel like relief, and sometimes it did. But more often, it felt like standing in shallow water, searching for something deeper without knowing where to swim. He wasn't unhappy. He just felt restless, as if peace were nearby but just out of reach. The swing creaked again as Henry shifted his weight. He rested his hands on his thighs and looked out at the dark yard. The grass moved slightly in the breeze, each blade responding in its own small way. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. Earlier that evening, he had found himself pacing the house, moving from room to room without purpose. He'd opened the fridge, then closed it, picked up his phone, then set it back down. The habits of motion were still there, even when there was nothing left to complete. Henry had spent years believing happiness was something you arrived at, a point on the map, a reward at the end of enough effort. He had chased it in promotions, in achievements, in the quiet pride of being useful. And now that the chasing had stopped, the question lingered. Why doesn't it feel the way I thought it would? He leaned his head back against the porch post and let his eyes rest on the dark sky. Clouds moved slowly across it, thinning and thickening, revealing stars and then covering them again. Nothing dramatic, just steady change. Henry remembered a story someone had told him once long ago during a quiet watch. A simple story, almost a joke. A fish swimming from place to place, asking everyone it met where to find the ocean. The other fish looked at it strangely and said, "This is the ocean." And the fish replied, "No, this is water. I'm looking for the ocean." At the time, Henry had laughed and moved on. Tonight, the story returned with a different weight. He thought about how often he'd treated happiness the same way, always just ahead, just beyond the next assignment, the next chapter, the next version of himself. He had been swimming in it, perhaps without ever noticing. The swing continued its quiet motion. Henry felt his breathing begin to match it. In, out. No effort required. His shoulders dropped slightly, a small release he hadn't asked for. He noticed how the night held everything without comment. The sounds, the dark, the slow movement of air. Nothing was trying to improve him. Nothing was asking him to be more than he was right now. Henry realized how deeply he had believed that peace required a different set of circumstances. Less noise, fewer questions, a clearer sense of direction. And yet sitting here, he couldn't point to anything missing. The porch light cast a warm circle around him, leaving the rest of the yard in shadow. The boundary felt kind, not limiting. Enough light to sit, enough darkness to rest his eyes. He thought about all the times he had postponed contentment. After this tour, after this promotion, after I finally slowed down. Each time the finish line had moved a little further out. What if the ocean wasn't somewhere else? What if it was the very thing he had been moving through all along? The thought didn't feel exciting. It felt quiet, almost obvious. The kind of realization that doesn't change anything on the outside, but loosens something on the inside. Henry placed his feet flat on the porch and let the swing slow to a stop. The night didn't rush him. It didn't need him to arrive anywhere. He sat there breathing, listening, feeling the simple fact of being held by the moment. Not searching, not reaching, just floating. And for the first time since retiring, the restlessness eased, not because it had been answered, but because it no longer needed to be. Henry let the swing come to rest and stayed there anyway, as if the movement had simply shifted inward. The night felt settled now, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, only complete. The crickets kept their rhythm. The air moved when it needed to, and then grew still again. He noticed how different his body felt when he stopped scanning for what was next. His chest wasn't tight anymore. His jaw rested easily. Even the small ache in his lower back felt neutral, like something that didn't need to be fixed right now. For most of his life, Henry had trusted effort, motion, progress. Those things had carried him far, and he didn't resent them, but sitting on the porch, surrounded by the simple sounds of the night, he realized effort had also trained him to overlook what didn't require earning. Peace, it turned out, didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a sense of accomplishment. It felt more like permission, the permission to stop swimming for a moment and notice the water already holding you. Henry rested his hands loosely on his thighs and closed his eyes. Not to think, just to feel. The weight of his body on the swing, the steady ground beneath the porch, the air entering his lungs and leaving again without being asked. The story of the fish returned softer this time. The fish hadn't been foolish. It had been sincere. It simply hadn't known how to recognize the ocean because it had never experienced anything else. The search had made sense until it didn't. Henry smiled faintly at that. He had been sincere too. He had done what he knew how to do. He had chased what he believed would finally feel like enough. And now, with nothing left to chase, he could see it more clearly. The ocean wasn't a destination. It was a condition. It was the space that allowed everything else to move. The quiet support underneath effort, underneath struggle, underneath even the search itself. It had been present during every assignment, every long night, every question about what came next. Henry hadn't missed it. He just hadn't needed to notice it before. The porch light hummed softly above him. A cloud slid across the stars, dimming them, and then letting them reappear. Nothing in the sky seemed concerned about being seen the whole time. He thought about the future briefly, about mornings without alarms, days without clear objectives. The thought didn't scare him the way it had before. It felt open. wide, like water. Henry stood and pushed the swing gently so it wouldn't creak anymore, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The house welcomed him with the familiar smell of wood and quiet. He didn't turn on any lights. He didn't need to see everything clearly. In the bedroom, he moved slowly, changing into something comfortable, each motion unhurried. When he lay down, the bed accepted his weight easily. His breathing deepened without instruction. The day loosened its grip and slid away. As sleep approached, Henry felt the last trace of searching fade. There was nowhere he needed to get to tonight. Nothing he needed to solve. He was already in it. He always had been. The ocean didn't require recognition to be vast. It simply held. And held by that understanding, Henry drifted into rest, no longer looking for happiness, but finally allowing himself to feel the water he had been swimming in all along. There are times when we believe we're holding everything very carefully. Holding relationships, holding onto work, holding our image in other people's eyes, holding the future steady so it doesn't drift off the path we planned. But the tighter we hold, the more our hands begin to ache. And the strange truth is, the harder we grip, the more we lose. Grace is 62 years old, a retired librarian. She lives alone in a small house in the suburbs. That evening, she sits on the old porch swing outside. It creaks softly with each gentle sway. Night has fully settled in. The sun is gone. Only the warm yellow light from inside the house spills out just enough to reveal the yard in front of her. On the small table beside the swing sits a potted plant. The soil on top is dry. Grace reaches out and pinches a small handful between her fingers. The dirt is fine, mixed with tiny grains of sand. When she closes her hand, a few grains slip through and fall onto the porch floor with a faint, gritty sound. Grace opens her hand. The soil rests there quietly, more of it than before. She looks at that moment longer than she normally would. Not because it's special, just because it matches the feeling she's been carrying inside for months now. Since retiring, Grace has had more time. But with that time have come uninvited thoughts. Am I still useful? Am I falling behind? If I don't have my job anymore? Who am I? Those questions have made her grip tightly onto whatever she still has. Her routines, her relationships, her old habits. As if letting go would cause everything to slip away at once. She picks up another pinch of soil. This time she squeezes harder. More sand falls. Tiny grains escape through the spaces between her fingers, impossible to hold. Grace exhales slowly. Not sadly, just noticing. Some things in life don't slip away because we didn't hold them tightly enough. They slip away because we held them the wrong way. Like sand. It doesn't respond to pressure. It needs to be held gently, not crushed. Grace returns the soil to the pot. She smooths a thin layer over the surface and pats it lightly. A familiar movement, no thought required. When she gardens, she knows this instinctively. Plants don't need to be gripped. They need space. Space for roots to breathe, for water to soak in, for light to reach them. She leans back into the porch swing. The steady creak rocks the quiet air. She notices her shoulders are tense, not painful, just holding. She lets them soften, allowing the swing to support her back. Her exhale grows a little longer. A memory drifts up. A day at the beach when she was young, trying to carry sand home in her fist. She squeezed as hard as she could, but when she opened her hand, only a few grains clung to her skin. She remembers feeling disappointed. Now she smiles at the memory. Sand was never meant to be taken. It was meant to be felt, and then left behind. Grace looks out at the dark yard. There's nothing she needs to guard. No one she needs to prove herself to. Just a quiet evening and someone relearning how to open her hand. If you're listening to this and recognize how tightly you've been holding things, plans, emotions, the future, that's okay. Many people do it out of fear of losing. But tonight you might not need to grip so hard. Maybe you don't lose things when you open your hand. Maybe you're tired because you've been holding on for too long. Grace lifts her hand in front of her and opens her palm. Not clenched, not stretched wide. Just open enough. A cool breeze passes over it, gentle, taking nothing away. She rests her hand on the arm of the swing. The soil stays in the pot. The sand stays on the porch. Nothing disappears when she stops squeezing. And in that very quiet moment, Grace understands some things. When held with gentleness, stay much longer than anything we try to grip tightly. Grace remains on the porch swing. The night has grown deeper, the air noticeably cooler. The daytime sounds have faded, leaving only a few distant, barely there noises, as if the whole neighborhood is slowing down together. She rests both hands on her thighs. Her palms are open, not stretched wide, not clenched, just open enough to rest. The swing moves gently, creaking in a steady rhythm. Not fast, not slow. Like the breathing of someone who no longer needs to keep watch. Grace looks at her hands, hands that worked for an entire lifetime, holding books, taking notes, organizing, preserving. For a long time, she believed her value lived in what those hands could hold, keeping things in place, preventing disorder. But tonight, with her hands open, she doesn't feel loss. She feels light. A breeze passes by, not strong, not carrying anything away. It touches her skin, then moves on. Grace doesn't react by closing her hands. She lets the wind pass, like letting a thought pass, without needing to keep it. There are things in life we only realize never truly belong to us when we stop gripping them. They were only passing through, borrowing us for a moment, so they could be felt. Like sand, like wind, like rolls we carried for many years until it was time to set them down. Grace stands slowly. She lifts the small potted plant and pours a little water into the soil. Not much, just enough. The water sinks in naturally without pooling. The earth absorbs it in its own way. No force required. She places the plant back where it was, wipes her hands on the small towel hanging by the door. The cloth is soft. The movement is gentle. There's nothing to hurry, nothing to hold. Inside the house, Grace doesn't turn on any more lights. The glow is just enough to see where she's going. She walks through the living room past the bookshelf without stopping. The books are still there. The stories remain. None of them disappear when she stops looking at them. Grace enters the bedroom. She changes clothes, folds them neatly, and sets them on the chair. No extra arranging, no fine adjustments. She pulls back the covers and lies down. The bed supports her body just as the porch swing did earlier, asking nothing of her. She places one hand on her stomach, one on her chest. Not to do anything, just to feel her breath move in and out. With each exhale, her fingers soften. They no longer hold the shape of a grip. A few thoughts drift through her mind. About tomorrow, about the years behind her. But they don't stay long. They arrive like sand touching her palm and fall away when her hand remains open. If you're listening to this and recognize how tightly you've been holding on for a long time, that's okay. You did it to protect yourself, to keep things from breaking apart. But tonight you can try another way. You don't need to hold everything. You don't need to prove you're still in control. You only need to open your hand and let what wants to stay in its own way. Sleep doesn't come when we grip it. Sleep arrives when we stop holding on. Grace closes her eyes, not because she decides to sleep, but because there's no longer a reason to keep them open. Her hands remain open, light still, and if you fall asleep at some point while listening, that's perfectly natural. If you're still awake, you're still resting in a very safe place. No gripping, no holding. Just letting everything fall and allowing yourself to rest. Fear doesn't always show up as panic. Sometimes it shows up as distance, a mind that keeps leaning forward, imagining everything that could go wrong, everything that hasn't happened yet. Your body might be standing still, but your thoughts are already far ahead, scanning the future, like it's a cliff you're about to fall from. Tyler learned this slowly. He was 34, a park ranger in a mountain region where people often came looking for quiet, but didn't always know what to do with it once they found it. That night, he was alone in the small ranger cabin, the kind with thick wooden walls and a single window facing the dark slope of the mountain. The wind moved through the trees outside, low and steady, not loud enough to be dramatic, just present. Tyler wasn't afraid of the mountain itself. He'd hiked it in every season. He knew the trails, the loose rocks, the places where snow stayed longer than expected. What unsettled him wasn't the terrain, it was the stretch of unknown ahead of him. A transfer request he hadn't answered yet, a relationship that felt like it was quietly changing shape. A future that didn't look dangerous, but didn't look clear either. He sat at the small table, boots still on, jacket unzipped. His headlamp rested beside his hand. He picked it up, turned it on, and pointed it toward the floor. The beam cut a clean circle of light over the wooden boards. Everything beyond that circle stayed dark. Tyler noticed something he'd known for years, but had forgotten to apply to himself. When you're climbing in the dark, you don't look down the mountain. You don't look for the summit either. You look for the next place to put your foot. That's it. One step, then another. Fear has a way of convincing you to look everywhere except where you are. His thoughts kept pulling him forward. What if this choice closes the wrong door? What if I regret it? What if I don't see the danger coming? Each question widened the imagined drop in front of him. The future became a vast space with no edges, no markers, no handholds. Tyler exhaled slowly and brought the light back down to the floor. The wood grain, a scratch near the leg of the chair, dust that would need to be swept in the morning. Ordinary things, solid things. The kind of details that don't disappear when you're afraid. Outside, the wind shifted. A branch tapped lightly against the cabin wall, then went still again. The mountain wasn't rushing him. The night wasn't demanding answers. He remembered his first winter climb years ago, how his instructor had stopped him mid-trail when Tyler froze staring down a steep slope. "Don't argue with the height," the man had said quietly. "Just place your foot." Back then it hadn't felt like wisdom. It had felt like survival. Now, sitting alone in the cabin, Tyler understood it differently. Fear wasn't asking him to solve his life. It was just asking for attention. And attention didn't mean obedience. He stood up, took a few steps toward the door, then paused. His hand rested on the handle. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just needed to feel the weight of his body balanced upright here. There was something grounding about realizing that even if the path ahead changed, this step, this moment, was stable. The floor held him. The walls held the warmth. The night held everything else without explanation. Tyler turned off the headlamp and let the darkness return. It didn't feel threatening now. It felt wide, like a space that didn't need to be filled. Fear often imagines the worst possible version of tomorrow. But tomorrow never arrives all at once. It comes as moments, steps, small decisions made with the information you have, not the information you wish you had. Tyler sat back down. He unlaced his boots slowly, listening to the soft rasp of fabric and metal. When he finished, he lined them up by the door, neat but not perfect. He didn't check his phone. He didn't rehearse conversations that hadn't happened yet. He let the mountain be what it was, something large, something steady, something that didn't need him to conquer it tonight. Sometimes peace doesn't come from feeling brave. It comes from remembering that you're not required to see the whole path, only the ground beneath you. The wind outside softened. The cabin settled into its quiet creaks and pauses. Tyler leaned back in his chair and allowed his gaze to rest on nothing in particular. The next step could wait. For now, this one was enough. Later that night, the cabin grew quieter in a way Tyler could feel rather than hear. The wind didn't stop, it just became part of the background, like a low breath moving through the trees. The kind of sound you don't need to follow. The kind that keeps going whether you pay attention or not. Tyler lay back on the narrow bed near the wall. He didn't turn off the small lamp right away. Its light was soft, barely reaching the corners of the room, leaving most things in shadow. The ceiling above him was simple wood. Nothing to figure out, nothing to interpret. His mind tried once or twice to wander ahead again, to the transfer request, to the future version of himself that might look back and judge this moment. But the thoughts didn't have the same grip. They arrived without urgency, then drifted off when nothing responded. He brought his attention to his body instead. The way the mattress supported his weight, the way his shoulders sank slightly once he stopped holding them up, the quiet rhythm of his breath already slower than before. In the mountains, Tyler knew panic often came from looking too far. People slipped not because the ground disappeared, but because their attention did. They leaned forward before their footing was secure. Fear works the same way in the mind. Tyler let that idea pass without holding on to it. He didn't need to turn it into ideas. He'd learned enough to know that understanding something didn't always mean doing something with it. Outside, a distant animal call echoed once, then faded. It didn't trigger alarm. It was just another reminder that the night had its own movements, its own language, one that didn't ask for interpretation. Tyler reached over and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but not completely. There was still a thin outline of the window, a faint suggestion of trees beyond it. Enough to orient himself, enough to feel safe. He remembered how on night climbs, experienced climbers trusted their lights not to show the whole route, but to show enough. Enough rock, enough ground, enough information to take the next step without guessing. That was all the light was ever meant to do. Fear often demands certainty. It wants guarantees, full maps, complete explanations. But the body doesn't need all that to rest. The body only needs to know that right now, it's not falling. Tyler placed one hand on his chest, the other resting loosely at his side. His fingers were relaxed, not curled into fists. His breath moved in and out without effort, without correction. The mountain didn't ask him to decide anything tonight. The future didn't ask him to arrive early. There was a quiet relief in realizing that uncertainty wasn't a threat. It was simply space. Space where things hadn't formed yet. Space that didn't need to be filled with fear. Tyler's thoughts grew less specific. They lost their sharp edges, becoming more like impressions than sentences. The idea of tomorrow softened. The need to resolve anything faded into the background. He didn't tell himself to sleep. He didn't tell himself to relax. He just stayed with the steady feeling of being held by the bed. Stayed with the sound of wind passing through branches. Stayed with the simple fact of being here now, without needing to move. At some point, the distinction between listening and drifting began to blur. His awareness widened, then thinned like a beam of light slowly dimming. The path ahead would still be there in the morning. The choices would still wait. For now there was no cliff, only solid ground beneath him, only one step already taken, and that was enough to let the night carry the rest. The mirror didn't break loudly. Grace noticed it the next morning when the light from the porch hit the glass at an angle it didn't usually reach. A thin line ran across the corner, quiet and pale, like something that had happened while no one was watching. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, holding her coffee, letting the kettle click off behind her. She didn't remember dropping it. She didn't remember a sound in the night. Just this line now here. Grace was 62, retired, the kind of person who noticed small things because life had finally slowed down enough to make room for them. She set the mug down, touched the edge of the mirror with one finger, careful not to press. The glass was still smooth. The crack didn't cut. It just interrupted. Later that evening, she carried the mirror out to the porch. The swing creaked gently as she sat down, the same sound it had made for years, steady and familiar. Crickets were already starting up in the yard. She rested the mirror against her knees, tilted slightly, catching the dim gold of the porch light. There had been a time when Grace would have thrown it out right away. Broken meant done. Replace it. Move on. But she didn't feel rushed tonight. She took a cloth from her pocket and wiped the surface slowly, not trying to fix anything, just clearing the dust. Her reflection fractured as she moved her face, appearing in pieces that didn't quite line up. It was strange how even a small break could change the whole image. Grace thought about how anger works the same way. It doesn't always come in shouting or slam doors. Sometimes it settles in quietly. It waits. It turns into distance, into silence, into the way you stop expecting anything good from someone without ever saying so out loud. She had been carrying that kind of anger for a long time. Not the explosive kind, the tidy kind. The kind you keep folded neatly, like a letter you never sent. Years ago, someone close to her had said something that couldn't be taken back. It wasn't dramatic. No betrayal, no shouting. Just a sentence that landed wrong and stayed there. A comment that made her feel small in a moment when she had trusted enough to be open. Grace never confronted it. She told herself it wasn't worth it, that she was being mature, reasonable. But the anger didn't disappear. It just hardened into something quieter. She adjusted the mirror on her lap. The crack caught the light again, more visible now. She wondered how many times she had replayed that moment in her head over the years, polishing it, turning it, letting it reflect different versions of the same hurt. Forgiveness had always sounded to her like pretending the crack wasn't there, like forcing the glass back into a shape it no longer had. She wasn't interested in that. The porch was cool now. A breeze moved through the trees, lifting the leaves just enough to make them whisper. Grace rested her hands on the frame of the mirror and let her shoulders drop. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to notice the weight she'd been holding. There's something exhausting about anger that doesn't get expressed. It stays active. It keeps checking the past, like it might change if you look at it one more time. It sharpens your memory. It edits your expectations. It makes the world feel a little harder than it needs to be. Grace hadn't realized how much of her energy had been leaking into that old moment until now, sitting here watching her reflection split and rejoin with every shift of light. She thought about what it would mean to fix the mirror. Not to make it invisible, not to erase the crack, but to let it exist differently. Years ago, she had seen a documentary about a Japanese art form, kintsugi, broken pottery repaired with gold. The cracks weren't hidden. They were traced, honored. The object wasn't restored to what it was before. It became something else, more honest, more deliberate. Grace smiled a little at the thought, not because it solved anything, just because it felt truer than the idea of going back to normal. She wasn't ready to forgive the way people usually talk about forgiveness. She didn't feel warm or generous. She didn't feel like reaching out. What she felt was tired. Tired of holding something sharp so carefully. She set the mirror down beside the swing and leaned back, letting it sway slightly. The rope creaked again. The sound filled the quiet in a way that didn't demand attention. For the first time in a long while, Grace considered this. Maybe forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. Maybe it's about changing how you carry what happened. The mirror, broken and still useful, waited beside her. It wasn't asking to be fixed tonight. It wasn't asking for a decision. It was just there. And for now, that was enough. Grace didn't try to repair the mirror that night. She left it leaning against the porch wall just inside the circle of light. Before going back into the house, she paused and looked at it once more. The crack was still there, clear and honest. Nothing had changed, and yet something had loosened. Inside, the house felt quieter than usual. Not silent, just unburdened. Grace moved through the rooms without turning on extra lights. The familiar sounds followed her, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the hallway clock. Ordinary sounds, anchoring sounds. When she washed her hands at the sink, she noticed how warm the water felt against her skin. She let it run a second longer than necessary, watching it slip through her fingers and disappear down the drain. There was no rush to finish, no thought she needed to catch. Anger often convinces us that it's doing something useful, that it's protecting us, that if we keep it close, we won't be hurt again. But standing there, hands wet, shoulders relaxed, Grace could feel how heavy that protection had been, how much effort it took to keep it intact. She dried her hands, slowly folded the towel neatly, and set it back where it belonged. Small motions done without commentary. Her body seemed to know what to do before her mind tried to explain it. Later, lying in bed, Grace stared at the ceiling fan as it turned at its lowest setting. The air moved gently across her face. She didn't replay the old conversation tonight. She didn't rehearse a response she'd never send. The memory still existed somewhere inside her, but it no longer demanded center stage. That surprised her. Forgiveness, she realized, might not arrive as a decision. It might arrive as a quiet reduction. Less tension in the jaw, less replaying, less heat behind the eyes. Not gone, just less. The broken mirror stayed on the porch for days. Grace passed it every morning, every evening. Sometimes she caught her reflection in it, split by that thin line. Sometimes she didn't look at it at all. One afternoon, she brought out a small box from the hall closet. Inside were odds and ends she'd kept without knowing why: buttons, a loose earring, a tiny vial of gold-colored paint left over from a craft project years ago. She set the box down next to the mirror, then laughed softly at herself. Not today, she thought. There was no urgency to make it beautiful yet. What mattered more was that she had stopped seeing the crack as a failure. It was simply a record of pressure, of impact, of something that had met resistance and not fully broken. Grace rocked gently on the porch swing, eyes half closed. The air had cooled. Somewhere nearby, A dog barked once, then settled. The world continued without commentary. Anger, when held for too long, keeps the body alert. It tightens muscles. It sharpens the mind. It makes rest feel undeserved. Tonight, rest came without negotiation. Grace didn't forgive anyone in a grand way. She didn't make peace with the past. She didn't rewrite the story. She just stopped gripping it so tightly. And in that small release, something softened. The night felt wider, the air easier to breathe. The broken mirror waited patiently, unchanged. When Grace finally stood up to go inside, she didn't feel the need to bring it with her. It could stay where it was imperfect and whole enough. Some things don't need fixing right away. Some things only need space. As the lights went out and the house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, Grace felt her breath slow on its own. No effort, no instruction, just the quiet relief of no longer holding something sharp. The night held everything else. Some mornings don't arrive with energy. They arrive quietly, almost shy, like they're not sure if anyone is ready for them yet. Tyler was already awake when the light started to thin the darkness between the trees. He hadn't set an alarm. He rarely did on days like this. As a park ranger, his schedule shifted with the seasons, with weather, with things that didn't care much about clocks. That morning he stood on a narrow trail just before sunrise, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, breath visible for a moment and then gone. The forest was still. Not silent exactly, but waiting. The kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. Tyler took a few slow steps forward, boots pressing into damp soil. Somewhere above him, a bird began to sing. Just one. A thin, clear sound, unhurried, unafraid of being heard or not heard. It didn't repeat itself for effect. It didn't pause to see if anyone was listening. It simply sang the way it always did because that was what it did when the morning came. Tyler stopped walking. He hadn't meant to. His body just did it on its own. He stood there, head tilted slightly, listening. Another bird joined in, then another, each with its own rhythm, its own tone. None of them tried to match the others. None of them waited for permission. They weren't performing. They weren't proving anything. They weren't hoping for applause. They were just being birds. Tyler felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was tight. It wasn't a dramatic release, no wave of emotion, just a subtle shift, like when you unclench your jaw after holding it all night. Lately, he'd been carrying a quiet question around with him, one he didn't talk about much. It showed up when he scrolled through his phone at night, when he heard old friends talk about promotions or big moves or what's next. The question wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Am I doing enough? Enough on paper. His life was fine. Steady job, decent health, a small apartment close to the park. He liked his work. He believed in it. But sometimes, especially in moments of comparison, that didn't seem to count for much. The world was loud about success, about recognition, about being seen. And Tyler wasn't sure where someone like him fit into that noise. Another bird sang closer this time. Tyler smiled, almost without realizing it. Not because the sound was impressive, but because it was honest. The bird wasn't trying to be louder than the rest of the forest. It wasn't trying to stand out. It was simply responding to the morning. Tyler thought about how often he did the opposite. How often he checked to see if what he was doing mattered before he let himself enjoy it. How often he measured his days by reaction instead of by presence. How many times he'd waited for someone else to notice before he allowed himself to feel okay about where he was. The bird didn't wait. It sang again the same simple phrase as if nothing else in the world required its attention. Tyler leaned against a nearby tree, the bark cool through his jacket. He closed his eyes for a moment. The forest continued without him. The light shifted. The air moved. Nothing stopped just because he did. There was something oddly comforting about that. He realized that the birds weren't singing for the forest. They were singing from themselves, from whatever instinct or joy or necessity lived inside them. They didn't seem concerned with how their song landed. They didn't adjust their pitch to be more likable. They didn't question whether they deserved to be heard. They sang because singing was part of being alive. Tyler took a slow breath in, then out. The breath felt easier than it had earlier, like it didn't have to pass through as many tight places to get out. He thought about the small things he loved that no one ever clapped for. Early mornings like this, fixing trail signs, watching fog lift off the ground, listening to the woods wake up. None of it earned praise. None of it went online. But it filled something real in him. Maybe value didn't have to be loud. Maybe it didn't have to be proven. Maybe it didn't even have to be witnessed. Another song rose from the trees, then faded naturally without a dramatic ending. No grand finale. Just a soft return to quiet. Tyler opened his eyes. The sky was lighter now. Not bright yet, but changing. He straightened up, brushed his hands together, and took a step forward on the trail. The birds continued behind him, unconcerned with whether he stayed or went. As he walked, the question that had been following him didn't disappear completely, but it felt less heavy, less demanding, like it didn't need an answer right now. He didn't need to sing louder. He didn't need to wait for approval. He just needed to keep moving through his own morning at his own pace, and somehow that felt like enough for now. Tyler kept walking as the light slowly spread between the trees. The trail curved gently ahead, familiar, but never boring. He'd walked it hundreds of times in different weather, different moods, different versions of himself. It always looked slightly new anyway. The birds were still singing, though, not all at once anymore. One would call out then, another leaving small pockets of quiet in between. The pauses felt just as important as the sound itself. Nothing rushed to fill them. Tyler noticed how his steps had fallen into an easy rhythm. Not forced, not measured, just moving. His shoulders dropped a little more with each breath, as if his body was remembering something it had forgotten during the week. He thought about how often he'd treated his own life like a performance, even when no one was watching. How he'd edited himself internally, adjusting tone and pace, wondering how things looked from the outside. It was exhausting, living as if there were always an audience somewhere beyond the trees. The birds didn't live that way. They didn't ask if the forest approved of their song. They didn't replay it later, wondering if they could have done it better. They didn't compare themselves to the bird 3 branches over. They sang. And when they were done, they stopped. Tyler slowed and sat on a fallen log near the edge of the trail. The wood was cool and slightly damp solid beneath him. He rested his elbows on his knees and let his gaze soften, not focused on anything in particular. The forest continued its quiet work around him. There was something healing about realizing that his worth didn't have to be constantly reaffirmed, that he didn't need to earn the right to exist comfortably in his own life. He could just be here, breathing, listening, taking up space without apology. He hadn't always believed that. Growing up, praise had come with conditions. Do well, be useful, make sense to other people. Over time, he'd learned to translate attention into value silence, into doubt. If no one was responding, maybe he wasn't doing enough. Maybe he needed to try harder. But the forest offered no feedback like that. It didn't reward or withhold. It simply allowed everything to exist in its own way. Tall trees, small birds, quiet mornings, all of it counted. Tyler felt a small smile touch his face again. Not because he'd figured something out, but because he didn't feel the need to figure anything out anymore. The pressure to define himself softened the way fog lifts without being pushed. A bird landed on a nearby branch close enough for Tyler to hear the flutter of wings. It stayed for a moment, then lifted off again. No drama, no attachment, just motion. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the sounds layer over one another, the birds, the wind, his own breathing. Each sound arrived, stayed, and moved on. None of them asked to be held. When he opened his eyes, the morning felt fully present now. Light had reached the forest floor. Colors had returned. Tyler stood brushing dirt from his hands and continued down the trail. As he walked, a thought surfaced, simple and unforced. Maybe I don't need to be seen to be real. It wasn't a declaration, just a quiet noticing. The birds kept singing behind him, not concerned with whether he remembered them later. They weren't building a case for their importance. They were living it moment by moment, without explanation. Tyler reached the point where the trail split. He paused, then chose the left path, the one that dipped slightly before rising again. He didn't analyze the choice. It just felt right. The forest held him as he moved forward. No spotlight, no applause, no judgment. Just the steady presence of something larger where every small voice had its place. By the time the trail opened up near the ranger station, the birds had quieted. The morning had moved on. Tyler felt ready to move with it. He didn't feel suddenly confident or transformed. He didn't feel certain about everything ahead. But he felt settled, like something inside him had found its natural pitch again. Not too loud, not too small, just true to itself. And that he realized was enough. Some evenings, Ben feels like his mind is a body of water that refuses to stay still. Not big waves, just small ripples, one after another, enough to keep him from seeing the bottom. And his familiar reflex almost immediately is to do something to smooth it out. Think more, organize more, check again. As if acting fast enough, precisely enough, will make the surface finally go quiet. Ben is 31, the founder of a small company that's growing very fast. His apartment that night is quieter than usual. The living room light is dimmed. His laptop is closed, placed neatly on the coffee table like an object that has finished its job for the day. But Ben hasn't. He stands by the glass table, a cleaning cloth in his hand, slowly wiping away faint smudges he's already cleaned at least twice. The cloth makes a very soft sound against the glass, almost unnoticeable. Still, Ben keeps going, side to side, up and down, turning the cloth, as if making the surface clear enough might calm the thoughts in his head as well. While his hands repeat this familiar motion, his mind stays busy with unanswered questions. Was today's decision the right one? Should that email have been sent with a different tone? Is this growth sustainable or just temporary luck? There's something strange about overthinking. It rarely shows up as panic. It often arrives disguised as care, as responsibility, as wanting to do things well. Ben doesn't think he's anxious. He just thinks he's taking care of things, but his body knows otherwise. His shoulders are tight, his jaw slightly clenched, his breathing shorter than usual. He pauses and looks at the glass surface, now clean enough to reflect the light. In it, he sees his own reflection, soft, a little blurred, not sharp, not perfect. And a familiar thought appears: not enough, not clear enough, not solid enough, not calm enough. Ben keeps wiping, but the more he wipes, the more he notices new marks, not because the glass is dirtier, but because he's looking too closely. The harder he tries to smooth it out, the more tiny movements appear, the kind no one would normally notice. Like trying to iron the surface of a lake with a hot iron. Each touch doesn't flatten the water. It creates more movement spreading outward. He sets the cloth down on the table. It's only a brief moment, but long enough to realize he isn't standing there because the table is dirty. He's there because something in his mind is pushing him to intervene, to make everything okay right now, as if doing nothing would cause everything to slip out of control. Ben sits down on the sofa. He doesn't lean back right away. He just sits, elbows resting on his thighs, hands hanging loosely in the space between. A longer exhale escapes than he expects. Not a breath of relief, just the breath of a body tired from trying to keep the water calm all day. He looks around the room. Everything is still there. Nothing collapses when he stops cleaning the table. No email turns into a disaster. No decision becomes instantly wrong just because he stays still for a few extra seconds. The realization doesn't bring immediate ease, but it creates a very small opening. A pause between reflex and action. Maybe the problem isn't that the lake is too restless. Maybe it's that he won't let it settle on its own. Water, when it isn't stirred, has a natural way of returning to stillness. But that requires something Ben isn't used to: allowing time without control. He leans back this time and does nothing. No analyzing how he feels, no naming the state, just letting the quiet in the room spread. One thought drifts through, then another. He doesn't chase them. He doesn't push them away. He lets them come and go like small ripples that don't need to be flattened by hand. If you're listening and you recognize this habit of constantly intervening in your own mind, that's okay. You're not doing anything wrong. You're just using the same tool for every situation. But some bodies of water don't need ironing. They only need to be left alone. Ben stays seated. The glass table is no longer being wiped. And for the first time that evening, he notices this not all quiet has to be created. Some quiet appears when we stop interfering. Ben stays still on the sofa longer than he expects. Not because he decides to meditate or do anything special. There's just no urge to get up right away. When you're used to constant intervention, doing nothing can feel strange at first, and then slowly it starts to feel normal. The air conditioner hums steadily in the background. A sound he hasn't noticed all day now becomes the only thing happening. It doesn't demand anything. It doesn't push. It's simply there. Ben realizes his shoulders have lowered at some point, not fully relaxed, just no longer braced. And that alone lets his breathing find a slower rhythm. A thought appears, the kind that usually makes him jump up and check his phone. But tonight it arrives, and then pauses. Not because Ben forces it to stop, just because there's no reaction following it. Like tossing a pebble into water, if no one keeps stirring, the circles widen on their own and fade. Ben looks toward the glass table. Its surface reflects the dim ceiling light. Not perfect. There are still tiny marks you'd only notice if you looked closely. But he doesn't get up to fix them. A very light feeling passes through him, almost surprise. Apparently he can leave something imperfect as it is, and nothing bad happens. He places both feet on the floor, noticing the faint coolness of the tile. For a moment he realizes he's been living in his head all day, and this is the first time he's really back in his body, not through thinking, but through simple sensations, feet on the ground, back against the sofa, air touching skin. If someone asked Ben what he was doing right now, he probably wouldn't know how to answer. Not working, not resting in the usual way, just letting things run on their own. And in this, not doing, a very quiet kind of trust begins to form. Trust that the lake knows how to settle. Trust that not every moment needs a hand stepping in. Time passes without clear markers. Ben doesn't check the clock. He doesn't count minutes. He only notices that the urge to make things calm has softened. It hasn't disappeared, but it's light enough now that it no longer controls him. More like a gentle breeze than a firm push. He stands up unhurried and turns off the living room light. The apartment slips into a faint glow from the hallway. The space now feels like water after the wind has stopped. Not perfectly still, but calm enough to reflect. In the bedroom, Ben doesn't open his phone. He doesn't review tomorrow. He lies down and lets his body find the most comfortable position on its own. No adjusting the pillow again and again. No searching for the right posture. Just allowing his weight to be held by the bed. There's something Ben begins to understand, not through logic, but through direct experience. Peace doesn't come from forcing everything to be still. It comes from stopping the extra stirring. When reactions settle, the world doesn't need to be controlled as tightly as we think. If you're listening and you recognize this habit of ironing the lake in your own mind, that's okay. Tonight, you don't need to create silence. You only need to stop adding more disturbance. The water will find its shape again. If you fall asleep at some point, that's natural. There's no right or wrong moment, just the moment when your body finally feels safe enough to rest. And if you're still awake, there's nothing else you need to do. Just let this sound pass through like one last small ripple dissolving into the lake. Listen for a little while, and then let everything settle. By the time Rachel reached the parking lot, the rain had already decided what kind of night it was going to be. Not a storm, not anything dramatic, just steady rain falling straight down, soaking everything without asking permission. She paused beside her car keys, still in her hand, watching water slide across the windshield in thin, uneven lines. Her jacket was already damp at the shoulders. She could feel the cold beginning to seep in, the kind that doesn't shock you, just slowly settles. Rachel was 39, a single mom, an office administrator who spent most of her day holding things together quietly. Schedules, requests, small crises that weren't hers but somehow landed on her desk anyway. By the time she clocked out, she felt emptied out in a way that sleep alone didn't always fix. She opened the car door and sat down, closing it with a dull, heavy sound. The rain drummed softly on the roof, not loud, not gentle, just constant. For a moment, she didn't start the engine. She rested her forehead lightly against the steering wheel, eyes open, watching the wipers drag water aside only for it to return again. Clear, blurred, clear, blurred. That's what the day had felt like. Her mind replayed the small things. A missed call from her son's school, a comment from her supervisor that wasn't criticism but wasn't reassurance either. A to-do list that kept rearranging itself no matter how many boxes she checked. None of it was unbearable. All of it together felt heavy. Rachel sighed and leaned back into the seat. The rain didn't stop. It didn't respond to her mood. It didn't speed up or slow down because she needed a break. And oddly, that helped. Rain had a way of doing that, reminding her that not everything was reacting to her effort. Some things were simply happening whether she managed them or not. She turned the key. The engine came to life with a low hum. The heater kicked in slowly, air still cool at first. She reached up and wiped a small circle on the windshield with her sleeve, then stopped. The glass fogged again almost immediately. No point fighting it. Rachel let the wipers do their steady work. Back and forth, back and forth. Each pass cleared the view just enough to see the painted lines on the asphalt shining faintly under the lot lights. Driving home in the rain always made time stretch. Traffic slowed. Everyone moved more carefully. There was less urgency in the air, as if the world itself had decided to ease up. As she pulled out of the lot, Rachel noticed how the rain softened the edges of everything. Streetlights blurred into warm halos. Brake lights smeared into red reflections on the road. The usual sharpness of the city faded. She didn't have to see far ahead, just the car in front of her, just the curve of the road. Fear often showed up for Rachel like this, not as terror, but as accumulation. A sense that if she wasn't careful, something would slip. Something would go wrong. Someone would need her, and she'd be one step behind. But the rain didn't ask her to hurry. It soaked the road evenly, washing dust into the gutters, dulling the sharpness of the day. She remembered standing in rain as a kid, hating the wet clothes, loving the smell afterward. The way everything felt quieter once the rain passed. Rachel loosened her grip on the steering wheel. She hadn't noticed how tight it was until her hands relaxed. The car moved steadily forward. No skidding, no drama, just motion. The rain didn't fix anything. It didn't solve her problems. It didn't rearrange her responsibilities. But it changed the texture of the moment. And sometimes that was enough. She turned onto her street windshield wipers, still keeping rhythm, and felt a small, unfamiliar sense of relief. Not because things were suddenly better, but because she wasn't fighting the weather anymore. The rain could fall. The road could be wet. Her day could be heavy, and she could still make it home. By the time Rachel pulled into her driveway, the rain had softened into something quieter. It still fell, but more patiently now, as if it had said what it needed to say and was content to keep going without attention. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal. The rain tapping gently on the windshield. The house in front of her looked dim and familiar. One porch light glowing like it always did. Nothing about it promised answers. It just promised shelter. Rachel stepped out of the car and felt the wet ground beneath her shoes. The air smelled clean in a way it hadn't earlier, washed of dust and heat. She didn't rush. If her jacket got wetter, that was fine. It wasn't something she needed to fix right now. Inside, she kicked off her shoes by the door and hung her jacket on the back of a chair. A small puddle formed on the floor beneath it. She noticed it, then decided to leave it for later. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, just paused. She moved through the living room, turning on a lamp instead of the overhead light. The softer glow made the space feel gentler, as if the day had loosened its grip the moment she walked in. She filled a glass with water, took a slow sip, then another. Rain had a way of doing this, not erasing what came before, but rinsing it. Letting the sharp edges dull, letting things settle where they landed instead of scattering them further. Rachel sat down on the couch and leaned back, listening to the distant sound of rain through the walls. It was muffled now, almost like a memory of sound rather than the thing itself. Her shoulders dropped a little, then a little more. The worries from earlier didn't disappear. They were still there somewhere. Tomorrow would still come with its questions. Her responsibilities hadn't changed shape just because it rained. But the fear that usually wrapped itself tightly around those thoughts had loosened. She noticed how fear often tried to rush her, to solve, to plan, to imagine outcomes before they arrived. It liked to stay ahead of time, as if being prepared meant being safe. But tonight, the rain had slowed everything down enough that rushing felt unnecessary. The future could wait outside like the rain itself. Present, but not pressing. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Not to escape, just to rest them. Her breath found its own rhythm, longer on the exhale, quieter on the inhale. She didn't adjust it. She didn't guide it. She let it be what it was. There was a strange comfort in realizing that change didn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it came like rain, inconvenient, unwelcome, unavoidable, and then quietly did its work. The road outside had been dusty before. Tires kicked up grit, wind carried it everywhere. Now it lay darker, smoother, easier to drive on. The rain hadn't asked whether the dust wanted to leave. It just passed through. Rachel opened her eyes and looked around the room again. Everything was still where she left it. The couch, the lamp, the faint reflection in the window. But something inside her had shifted just enough to notice. She stood up, turned off the lamp, and let the room return to shadow. The house didn't need to be perfectly dry. The day didn't need to be perfectly understood. In the bedroom, she lay down without checking her phone, without rehearsing conversations or scanning tomorrow's list. The rain outside continued steady and unbothered. If fear was imagination reaching too far ahead, then peace, she realized, might be this allowing the moment to be exactly what it was, without adding more weight to it. The rain would stop when it stopped. The road would dry when it dried. Tomorrow would arrive when it arrived. For now, there was nothing she needed to outrun, nothing she needed to solve. Just the quiet work of letting the day be washed clean enough to rest. And as the rain carried the last of the dust away, Rachel let the night carry the rest. Nina didn't plan to garden that afternoon. She'd only stepped into her tiny backyard to take out the trash, still wearing her daycare t-shirt with a cartoon sun on the front. The day had been one long stretch of small hands and loud feelings, kids melting down over the wrong cup, the wrong snack, the wrong crayon. By the time she got home, her patience felt used up in the same quiet way a phone battery dies. Not dramatic, just suddenly red. The air outside was warm, but not sticky. The kind of late-day light that makes everything look softer than it felt. Nina paused near the fence and noticed a cluster of weeds pushing up along the edge of the garden bed. Thin stems, stubborn leaves, little green flags claiming space. She stared at them longer than she needed to, because that's what anger does sometimes. It finds a harmless target. She told herself, I should pull those. It'll take 5 minutes. It'll feel productive. She went inside, washed her hands, and came back out with a pair of gardening gloves she'd bought months ago and barely used. When she slid them on, the fabric felt stiff and new. Like it didn't know her yet, she crouched near the weeds and gripped the first one, hard tugging, straight up. It snapped. The top came off in her hand, while the rest stayed buried in the dirt. Nina's jaw tightened. She grabbed another and pulled even harder. Snap again. 2 clean breaks like the weeds were making a point. Of course, she muttered, more annoyed than the situation deserved. Nina was 35, and most people would describe her as calm, soft-spoken, good with kids, the kind of person who could talk a 3-year-old down from a full-body tantrum with a quiet voice and a silly song. But there was a version of her no one saw at work, a version that showed up later in the car, in the shower, or here alone in her backyard with dirt under her nails. That version was tired, and when she was tired, anger didn't look like shouting. It looked like tension. It looked like replaying the same moment over and over. It looked like holding a grudge against someone who probably wasn't even thinking about her anymore. Earlier that day, a coworker had said something small and sharp in the staff room. Not a scream, not a fight. Just a comment thrown casually the way people do when they're stressed and don't notice where their words land. Nina had laughed it off at the time, smiled, changed the subject. But the sentence followed her home like a burr stuck to her sleeve. Now crouched in the dirt, she realized she was pulling weeds the same way she'd handled that moment, trying to remove the visible part without touching what was underneath. Keep it neat. Keep it quiet. Don't make a scene. She stared at the broken stems in her gloved hand. The roots were still down there, untouched, holding firm. Nina shifted her weight and tried again, this time with a different grip. She pinched closer to the base, right where the plant met the soil. She loosened the dirt around it with her fingers, slow and careful. The earth was slightly damp, cool under the surface. She felt the plant give a little, then stop, then give again. When it finally came out, it brought a thin root with it, longer than she expected, pale and wiry, like a little cord. Nina held it up and stared, a little surprised. It wasn't the weed that was strong. It was the root. She sat back on her heels and looked at the rest of the patch. If she kept snapping the tops off, she could clear the surface quickly, sure. But the weeds would come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they'd return quietly, stubbornly, because the real part of them was still there. She knew that feeling. Anger, when she tried to be mature, didn't go away. It just went underground. It waited. It resurfaced later as sarcasm, as coldness, as a tight chest at night when she was trying to sleep. She pulled another weed, slow this time, loosening the soil first. It came out clean, root and all. The motion felt different in her body. Less force, more patience, more honesty. She thought about the co-worker's comment again, and for the first time she asked herself a question she usually avoided. What did that actually touch? Not the words themselves, the place they landed. Because the truth was, Nina's anger wasn't only about that one comment. The comment was just the top. Underneath it was a root, the feeling of not being respected, of being the one who always stayed late, the one who always cleaned up, the one who always said yes because she didn't want to be difficult, and then quietly resented everyone for expecting it. That was the root. Nina didn't judge herself for it. She didn't lecture herself about boundaries or communication. She just noticed it the way she was noticing the roots in her hand, thin but persistent, stretching farther than the surface suggested. A breeze moved through the yard. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's sprinkler clicked on. The sound was steady, rhythmic, almost like a metronome. Nina kept pulling weeds, one at a time, slower than she'd planned. And as she worked, she could feel the anger shifting, not disappearing, not turning into forgiveness on the spot, just changing texture. When she snapped the tops off, her anger felt sharp and urgent, like it needed to be acted on, like it needed to win, like it needed to do something. When she eased the roots out, her anger felt more like information, like a signal, like a part of her that was saying quietly, "You've been holding too much." Nina paused and rested her gloved hands on her thighs. She looked at the small pile of weeds beside her roots, exposed, no longer hidden. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. She realized something else too. Trimming the top had always been easier, faster, cleaner. It made her look calm. It kept her image intact. But pulling the root, naming what hurt, admitting what she needed, that was the part she avoided. Not because she didn't know how, because it made things feel messy for a minute. And Nina had spent most of her life trying not to be messy. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff. She brushed dirt from her gloves and looked at the garden bed. It wasn't perfect. There were still weeds. There always would be. Life kept growing things, some of them helpful, some of them not. But she could already tell the ones she'd pulled from the root weren't coming back the same way. She gathered the weeds into a small paper bag. The bag crinkled softly in her hands. As she walked toward the trash bin, she felt her shoulders lower just a fraction. A tiny release. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a speech, just a quiet understanding that sometimes anger isn't asking you to explode. Sometimes it's asking you to go deeper. And Nina, still tired, still human, still carrying the day on her skin, felt a little more willing to do that slowly, one root at a time. Nina didn't finish pulling all the weeds that day. She tied the paper bag loosely and left it by the back door, meaning to take it out later. The garden bed looked uneven now, some spots clear, others still crowded with green. It wasn't the neat before and after she usually preferred, and somehow that felt right. Inside, she rinsed her hands at the sink. Bits of dirt swirled away and disappeared, leaving her fingers clean, but a little tired. She noticed how the tension in her shoulders had eased without her telling it to. No deep breathing, no fixing, just less holding. That evening, as she folded laundry on the couch, the moment from work came back again. The comment, the tone, the way she'd smiled and swallowed her response. But this time, the memory didn't flare. It arrived quietly, like a weed she already recognized. She didn't push it away. She asked the same question again, gently. What's the root here? The answer didn't come as words right away. It came as a feeling in her chest. Tight, familiar. The feeling of being overlooked. Of being the one who adapts so others don't have to. Of being kind and hoping, maybe unfairly, that kindness would be noticed without being named. Nina let herself feel that for a moment. Not the anger on top, but the tiredness underneath. It was heavier, but also truer. And strangely, it didn't demand action. It just wanted to be seen. The washing machine clicked off. The sudden quiet filled the room. Nina stacked the towels, slowly aligning the edges without thinking too hard about it. Ordinary movements had a way of making space for things to settle. Anger, she realized, often comes from something reasonable, a need that's gone unspoken, a boundary that's been crossed too many times. When she cut it down at the surface, telling herself to be nice or let it go, that need stayed buried, still growing. That night, lying in bed, Nina didn't rehearse an argument. She didn't plan a confrontation. She didn't decide what she would say the next day. She simply noticed that she felt less tight than usual. Her breathing found its own rhythm, in and out, slower than earlier, without effort. The house made its nighttime sounds, pipes settling a distant car passing the soft tick of the clock in the hall. She thought about the garden again. How pulling the root took more patience, more time, and dirtier hands. How it also meant the weed didn't have to be fought again tomorrow. Not everything in her life needed to be resolved right away. Some things just needed to be acknowledged at the right depth. The next morning, Nina stood at the staff room counter pouring herself coffee. The coworker was there too, scrolling on her phone. Nothing dramatic happened. No apology, no repeat of yesterday. But Nina noticed something different in herself. When the coworker spoke, Nina didn't brace. She didn't shrink. She didn't smile automatically. She just listened, shoulders relaxed, attention steady. The anger that had been buzzing under her skin the day before wasn't gone. But it wasn't driving anymore. It had become information. Later during nap time at the daycare, the room was dim and quiet. Small bodies rose and fell on their mats. Nina sat in her chair, hands resting loosely in her lap. She felt tired but not depleted. There's a difference. Exhaustion that comes from giving too much feels sharp, resentful. The tiredness she felt now was softer, honest. The kind that comes from doing the work that actually matters. That afternoon when she got home, Nina stepped into the backyard again. The weeds she'd left were still there, of course. Life didn't rearrange itself overnight. She pulled one more slowly, feeling the soil loosen, the roots slide free. She didn't rush to finish. She didn't aim for perfect. Anger, she understood now, doesn't need to be cut down or crushed. It needs to be understood at the level it grows. Above that, everything is just maintenance. As dusk settled in, Nina left the garden as it was and went inside. The paper bag still waited by the door. The work could continue another day. For now, it was enough to know where the roots were. In bed, as the room darkened and the day finally released its grip, Nina felt her thoughts slow. Nothing needed to be solved tonight. Nothing needed to be pushed away. Some things, once seen clearly, stopped demanding so much energy. And with that, the mind, like the garden, was allowed to rest. By late afternoon, the porch was already half in shadow. Grace sat on the wooden swing with a thin cardigan pulled around her shoulders. Not because it was cold, but because the day had begun to let go of its warmth. The air carried that quiet feeling that comes just before evening, when nothing urgent is left to do, and the world doesn't expect much from you anymore. The swing moved slightly as she shifted her weight. Not enough to creak loudly, just a soft, familiar motion. Back and forth, back and forth. A rhythm she didn't think about until it was already happening. Across the yard stood the oak tree. It had been there longer than Grace had lived in the house, longer than her children had lived there, longer than most of the things that once felt important. Its trunk was thick and uneven, the bark rough and darkened with age. In the summer, it filled the yard with shade. In the winter, it stood bare and unremarkable, easy to overlook. Grace had noticed recently how people tended to overlook her too. It wasn't dramatic. No one was being cruel. It was quieter than that. Conversations moved around her instead of toward her. New ideas came from younger voices. Invitations arrived less often. When people spoke to her, it was with kindness, but also with a subtle assumption that her most active chapters were already behind her. She told herself it was fine. She had a good life, a steady routine, a job she'd done well for years. But sometimes, usually in moments like this, the thought would surface without warning. Do I still matter in the way I used to? The swing rocked again. Grace rested her hands in her lap and watched the oak tree's branches stretch outward, weight and heavy. Its leaves barely moved even when the breeze picked up. The tree didn't respond to the wind the way smaller trees did. It didn't rush. It didn't flutter. It stayed. She thought about how, when she was younger, she'd believed value came from visibility, from doing more, from being noticed, from having something to show. Back then she was all branches and leaves, busy spreading, reaching outward in every direction. Now much of that had slowed. Her days were quieter, more internal, less impressive from the outside. And part of her wondered if that meant something had been lost. The oak tree didn't seem to worry about that. It didn't try to look younger than it was. It didn't apologize for the thickness of its trunk or the heaviness of its limbs. It didn't chase attention with new growth every season. It simply stood there, rooted deep, holding the ground in a way that younger trees couldn't. Grace leaned back slightly, letting the swing support her weight. The wood pressed firmly against her spine, steady and real. She felt the tiredness in her body, not the sharp kind, but the deep layered kind that comes from years of showing up. The oak tree had rings. She knew that. Layers beneath the bark, each one marking a season of growth. Stress, weather, survival. None of them visible unless the tree was cut open. None of them obvious to someone passing by. And yet those unseen layers were the reason the tree could stand the way it did. Grace exhaled slowly. The thought settled somewhere inside her, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. Maybe value didn't live in what people could see anymore. Maybe it had moved underground. She looked at her hands. The skin thinner than it used to be, veins more visible. These hands had held children books, grocery bags, grief, joy. They had done their work quietly, without needing to be admired. The swing rocked again, a little wider this time. The evening insects had started their low hum. Grace didn't turn on the porch light. She liked the half-light. It made everything softer, less defined. She thought about the younger version of herself, always reaching, always stretching toward the next thing. That version had been necessary, but it wasn't the only one that mattered. The oak tree had once been young too. Now its strength was not in how far it reached, but in how deeply it held. Grace sat with that image as the sky dimmed further. The yard grew still. The tree didn't move much at all, but somehow it felt more present than anything else around her. She didn't need to decide what this meant yet. She didn't need to turn it into a lesson or a reassurance. It was enough to notice the shift, to feel the weight of something steady beneath the surface. The swing slowed on its own. Grace let it. As the evening deepened, the air around the porch seemed to slow. The colors in the yard softened, edges blurring slightly, as if the day itself were getting ready to rest. Grace stayed where she was, letting the swing move less and less until it barely shifted at all. The oak tree remained in front of her, solid and patient. She realized she had never once worried about whether the tree was still useful. No one questioned its worth because it no longer grew quickly. No one expected it to prove anything. Its presence alone felt enough. More than enough. The shade it gave, the way it held the soil in place, the quiet sense of continuity, it all happened without asking for attention. Grace thought about how different that felt from the way people often treated themselves. How easily value became tied to output, to recognition, to how visible or impressive one appeared to be. And how, as those things naturally shifted with time, a quiet fear could slip in, whispering that something essential had been lost. The oak tree didn't seem to believe that story. Its roots were invisible, buried deep beneath the surface. They weren't admired. They weren't photographed. But they were doing the real work. Holding, nourishing, keeping the whole structure steady through storms that never made headlines. Grace placed her feet more firmly on the porch floor and let the swing come to a stop. The stillness felt kind, not empty. She noticed how her breathing had slowed, how her chest rose and fell without effort. Her body at least seemed to understand something before her thoughts did. She remembered a time years ago when she had been afraid of slowing down. Afraid that if she stopped pushing, she might disappear. That if she wasn't reaching outward, she wouldn't matter anymore. But sitting there now, she didn't feel like she was fading. She felt grounded. The oak tree had weathered seasons Grace could barely remember. Droughts, heavy rains, winters that stripped it bare. And still it stood. Not because it tried harder each year, but because it had learned how to hold itself from the inside. Grace rested her hands on the arms of the swing. The wood was smooth from years of use. Familiar, reliable. She thought about all the ways her own life had developed unseen strength through patience, through care, through simply staying when leaving would have been easier. Those things didn't show up on the surface, but they were there. The evening insects grew louder, then settled into a steady pattern. The world didn't rush her to come inside. It didn't demand reflection or resolution. It simply continued, allowing her to be part of it without effort. Grace's gaze drifted back to the oak tree one last time before the light faded completely. She didn't feel the need to compare herself to it. The image wasn't a lesson. It was a quiet companionship. A reminder that growth doesn't always look like expansion. Sometimes it looks like depth. She stood slowly, joints stiff but cooperative, and reached for the porch light. When it came on, the yard changed again, smaller, more contained. The oak tree was still there, partially lit, partially in shadow. Unbothered by the change, Grace paused, hand still on the switch. She didn't feel the urge to hold on to the moment. She didn't feel like she might lose something if she moved on. What she had noticed would stay with her the way certain understandings do not, as thoughts to repeat, but as a steadier way of standing. Inside the house, the evening waited quietly. Grace stepped in and closed the door behind her. The oak tree remained outside, rooted and patient, doing what it had always done. Not reaching for the sky anymore, not needing to be seen from far away, just holding the ground. And somehow, that felt like the truest kind of strength there was. There are moments when Henry feels like he's being held in place, not by a specific event and not by anyone else. Just a familiar feeling like sitting in a room where the door is always behind you. You know it's there. You may have even opened it before. But tonight you're still sitting as if an invisible thread is keeping you tied to that familiar chair. Henry is 58, retired for a few years now. His house has been quieter since the children moved out. That evening, he sits in the rocking chair on the front porch. The wood creaks softly with each gentle sway. A light breeze carries the scent of dry leaves and damp grass. Nothing is unusual. Everything feels like many other evenings before. He rests his hands on the armrests, fingers loosely intertwined. Not gripping, not fully letting go. A posture so familiar, it feels like his body learned it long ago. Henry looks out into the darkness beyond the yard. A distant streetlight is bright enough to outline the trees, but not enough to reveal details. The darkness isn't threatening. It's just there. A small sound comes from inside the house, the refrigerator kicking on, then falling quiet again. Henry stays seated. Not because there's anything he needs to watch over, just because he's used to sitting like this. Years ago, for a long time, he learned how to always be ready. Listening, watching, staying still. When a habit once helped, it became instinct. And instincts rarely disappear on their own, even when circumstances change. He rocks the chair one more time. The wood creaks again. The steady sound is almost soothing. Henry notices he's waiting for something to happen, but he doesn't know what that something is. There's no specific danger, no problem to solve. Just a sense that he should be here, should stay alert, should be ready. Some prisons don't need high walls. They don't need bars. They exist through habit, through staying in the same place, the same posture, the same reactions, even when the door has been open for a long time. No one locked it. But no one reminded you that you're allowed to stand up. Henry glances toward the front door. The white wooden door is slightly ajar. Not locked. Just a few steps and he could go inside, turn off the porch light, and rest. The thought appears clearly. Then, drifts away. He remains seated. Not because he doesn't know he can leave, but because a part of him has grown used to staying. Staying with vigilance. Staying with the feeling that something is not finished. Staying with the idea that if he looks away, something might happen. The wind moves the branches gently. A dry leaf falls onto the porch with a soft sound. Henry turns his head out of reflex, then pauses when he realizes there's nothing to respond to. A very small moment, but enough for him to notice he did that out of habit. Not because of danger, just because his body learned to react that way. He exhales, a little longer than before. Not a sigh, just a fuller breath leaving his body. The rocking chair comes to a stop. The wood goes quiet. In that stillness, Henry feels something unexpected and no one is guarding him. There's no lock, no rule requiring him to stay here another minute. And at the same time, another feeling arises, not quite relief, but uncertainty. If he doesn't sit here anymore, then what does he do? When a habit has lasted long enough, letting go isn't just about opening a door. It's about stepping into an undefined space. Henry places one foot down onto the porch floor, noticing the coolness through the sole of his shoe. He doesn't stand up yet. He just leaves his foot there like a small test. Nothing happens. No alarm. No consequence. If you're listening and you recognize this habit of staying in an old state simply because it's familiar, that's okay. You're not imprisoned. You're just doing something you once learned very well. The question isn't, how do I escape? The question is, have you noticed that the door is already open? Henry keeps his foot resting on the porch floor a little longer. He doesn't lift it right away. He just leaves it there as if his body is getting used to the idea that it can change position. The rocking chair stands still behind him, now no pulling, no holding. The breeze moves through the porch cool and steady, carrying no warning signals at all. He realizes something very simple all this time. No one has been guarding him. He's the one who kept sitting in that spot, repeating the same reaction, the same state of readiness, even when there was nothing left to protect against. And this realization doesn't make him sad. It just makes things clearer. Henry stands up. Not quickly, not with resolve. He stands the way someone stands after sitting for a long time, slow, a little cautious. The chair makes a faint sound as his weight leaves it, then goes quiet. He looks back at it for a second. It's still there, available for another time. Just not now. He takes one step toward the door, then another. The distance from the chair to the front door turns out to be shorter than he thought. Just a few steps. No clear boundary. No line separating being held from being free. Just a series of small movements he hadn't really noticed before. Henry opens the door. The hinge makes a soft sound. A familiar noise from a house at rest. He steps inside and closes the door behind him, not to lock himself in, but to keep the night air outside. Inside, the light is warm and gentle. This space is familiar too, and safe, but in a different way. Less tense. He stands still in the living room for a moment, unsure what to do next. And then he realizes he doesn't need to do anything at all. Not every moment has to be filled with action. Some moments only need permission to exist. Henry turns off the living room light. The brightness fades, not abruptly, just enough to soften everything. He walks toward the bedroom. Each step unhurried, not because he's tired, but because there's no longer a need to rush. His body seems to be learning a new rhythm, the rhythm of someone who doesn't have to keep watch. When he lies down, Henry doesn't think about tomorrow. He doesn't think about the past. He doesn't replay what he should have done differently. He just feels the mattress supporting his back feels the breath moving in and out, no longer caught in his chest the way it was before. A thought passes through, what if something happens? It arrives quickly like an old reflex, and then it leaves just as quickly. Not because he argues with it, but because no one feeds it anymore. No habit stands up alongside it. Henry understands something now. Freedom in this moment isn't about doing something new. It's about stopping something old, about no longer sitting in a room where the door has already been open, about letting go of a position that's no longer needed. And it doesn't require great effort. It only requires noticing and allowing yourself to shift. If you're listening and you recognize that you're also in some kind of open cell, a familiar state and an old reaction, a loop of thinking that no longer serves you, then tonight you don't need to break down any doors. You don't need to run anywhere. You only need to notice that you're not locked in. You can stand up anytime, or you can sit a little longer if you want. Freedom doesn't rush you. It simply waits for you to notice it's been there all along. Henry's breathing slows. The space between his thoughts stretches out. There's no single moment marking a shift. No bell ringing. Just a body slowly understanding that it's allowed to rest. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's perfectly fine. You're not missing anything. The door doesn't close when your eyes do. It stays there open, quiet, undemanding. And if you're still awake, there's nothing else you need to do. Just stay still. Breathe out once more and let the old habit fade when nothing is feeding it anymore. Tonight, no one is holding you captive. There is only a place safe enough for you to stop being on guard and rest. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go. Drift, and let these truths become your own. My thoughts are settling like sediment in a glass of still water. Go of all ripples. The surface of my mind is becoming glass. Like a river flows to the ocean, my worries flow away from me. Obstacles without resistance. The waters of sleep are washing over my tired eyes. floating in a sea of tranquility, weightless and free. Breath is like the tide, flowing in and flowing out. Deep below the surface waves, my inner ocean is silent. I release the day just as a leaf drifts down a stream. Cool, healing water soothes my nervous system. Merging into the velvet depths of rest. There is no need to swim. I simply float. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. Clear, transparent, and still. I am clear, transparent, and still. Transparent and still. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Water fills a cup. Water fills a cup. Fills me like water fills a cup.